We are live on Nerdist and Geek and Sundry's YouTube channels. I'm Rachel Heine, and joining me, as always, are my longtime Alpha Book Club turned Nerdist Book Club co-hosts, Maude, Garrett, and Hector Navarro. Hey, guys.
Hi.
Hello. I am in the process of getting wine right now, so bear with me 1 second.
There's going to be a hand that reaches out with the glass. What if it was one of your cats? That would be like, I would be so the most jealous if you could train your cat to hand you wine. And hey, thanks to everyone at home for joining us for our online live book club where we just discuss all of our favorite nerdy books with you. And of course, drink wine. You're as much a part of this book club as all of us, so welcome if you're joining for the first time. Welcome back if you've been here with Nerdist Book Club, and a third version of that for everyone joining us from Alpha Book Club, because we are so glad that you're here. And please let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you're watching after the fact on VOD, let us know. We do check those. Tweet at us, send us your book recommendations, but you're as much a part of this as we are, so welcome very much. Last week, you all voted, and we have started a new book, which I would wager is the most, it's different than any other book we've read so far, which I think is really interesting and going to have a lot of conversation about. So we are reading Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. And just before we get into the book itself, we do want to give a bit of a content and trigger warning. This book, a huge one, and it deals with a lot of harsh actions and themes ranging from violence to sexuality. So just take care when you're watching this and use discretion if you think this discussion is for you. If it's not a book that you feel comfortable reading, we'll be here next month. We're not going to judge. Just take care of yourselves. It's been a process for us reading it as well too, but we're excited to chat about it with you and try to dive into why we might feel uncomfortable, the language style, the subject matter. So with that said, let's dive into it. Spoiler-free impressions of this first section we've read so far. Maude, going to you.
I need a hug.
Yeah.
I need to be held. I need a hug. I need someone to tell me that everything's going to be okay. And anyone who wants to time travel and go back in time, don't ever. Don't go back, because it's bad. It's not a good place for women. It's not a good place to be alive.
That's such an interesting, whenever I've had this come up in conversations about time travel, like, where'd you want to go back to? And I think most people who are not white dudes, straight white dudes especially, are like, I don't know if any time would be that fun for me if I didn't figure out some workaround there. So Hector, what do you think so far?
This book is unlike any book I've ever read. It is also, for just to give a little a little background, I did some research on the author and sort of his story, and we're going to talk about that, which really helped a lot. Like, I read one chapter, right? I read one chapter and I was like, wow, this is so different than anything that I'm kind of used to reading, even in a fantasy genre. And we just did The Hobbit a few, like 2 books ago. You know what I mean? We've done like otherworldly language. We've done stuff that is fantastical. And this is very different. So reading a little bit about the author and looking at some interviews and stuff provided me with more context. And my feeling of the book right now is that it is very interesting. And there's a lot to discuss and a lot to talk about. And there's a lot of chewy stuff in there. And yet it also feels like, I want to try to describe this correctly. Like, it feels like it is a fairy tale or like a myth that is being told, and that it might be sometimes difficult to connect with. When you're a kid and you read like fairy tale stuff, or you read like, the Odyssey, or you read anything that is in a language that is not something that you're used to speaking. And there is an element to like the pantheons of gods involved in this that makes me think of things like my connection with those stories, which is mostly like Marvel Comics. And Marvel Comics is not that at all, because Marvel Comics and comic books, they're grounded, or they're at least like modern entry points, right? I love Wonder Woman, and that movie and that world has to deal with similar ideas where it's like gods that have come down to our planet and they're real, and these myths are real, and yet after centuries and centuries, what of it has actually happened? What of it is just like hearsay or myth telling or storytelling? And I think it's all purposeful. So as I'm reading the book, there are moments where I might not be connecting or necessarily feeling like I know what's happening and what's not. And then it'll cut to another moment where I'm like, whoa. And it's something that hits very emotionally, and it feels very real, and it feels very, does that kind of make sense? The way that I'm trying to describe it?
I did a bit of
Please.
research as well. I was reading some reviews just to try and get a handle on it and to see how other people were feeling. I mean, I went into /fantasy on Reddit. Like, I really kind of wanted to learn more, and not many books make me want to delve this deep, but I think I needed a layer of protection somehow. But I found this review that was published on npr.org, and it's just of so many things. I'm just like, yes. And I wanted to read it out, actually, just a passage of this. Yeah. So you guys watching can relate as well. There's this book is not to be read in a hurry, and yet it's difficult to dwell in. Besides the viciousness of its contents, frequent rapes and mutilations of men, women, children, related both matter-of-factly and in harrowing detail, which I struggled with. I actually really struggle with rape in a matter-of-fact breakdown like that. That's really confronting. The book fights against its own chosen style, the oral telling of stories marked by interruption and digression towards the dark and upsetting, almost as a toll to be paid for pursuing the narrative. I was like, whoa.
That's a great way to put it.
Brilliant, yeah.
A toll to be paid for pursuing the narrative. That's a great way to put it.
Hector, as you were saying, with how this book is written, it goes on to say, the beautiful flexibility of voice is counterpointed by a stiff absence of anything around long passages of dialogue, such that exchanges between characters feel like reading a play, which is what I noticed, or like archery, a twang, an arrow shot, and only the reply indicates whether or not it's hit its target.
Interesting.
That's some great writing.
Isn't
really
that
great writing?
So fantastic.
A really brilliant way to write about it. And I think there are a couple, we'll dive into all of it, but there are a couple different things here in terms of the style of the language, the fact that narrative is not necessarily I can't speak to the actual goal, but it does not feel like the main driving factor in this. It is much more about the lyricism and the shock and sorry, there's a helicopter. But especially I think we've read other fantasy stories before, either on this book club or ourselves, but reading Dodo Kiwi hits the nail on the head. This book makes me realize how much fantasy books are so slanted to a European or Western history in general. Yes. And I've been, we're all reading all the time, and I've been reading White Fragility, which I recommend to anyone. But thinking about the framework of how the norm in so many things is white, or is sort of this European mentality. And so, obviously this book has been compared to, Game of Thrones in some way, but I don't agree with that. I don't. And I'm trying to understand it. I think it's because there's absolutely nothing like this book out there, and because it's set in a fantasy setting, and because it has a lot of gratuity, like violence and sexual violence, that's like the only other thing that they can kind of. It's in a realm of a wheelhouse, but it's not. It's just absolutely not like that at all. And what I had to learn really quickly was that the reason why I needed a hug was because I was thrown outside my comfort zone. And it was really like kind of important for me to learn, understand, and figure out why. And the obvious one is I don't like being inundated with topics that I prefer to stay in my safe bubble. Sure. I don't really like exploring or the normalization, I guess, of all the really shitty things that are happening in the world. And I acknowledge and I understand that they exist, but I think for me, I need a little bit more of a why and how the bad, like where's the hope? And I really do kind of like, I'm fueled by hope. And straight away in chapter 1, there was just such a desolation presented to me in terms of domestic violence and abuse. There was just. And
it opens with a dead child. Yeah. Chapter 1 opens with, the child is dead. And it's so interesting that the Game of Thrones comparison is being brought up. I haven't read Game of Thrones yet. I've only seen the first season of the show.
I have. And we actually spoke about that when I was like, time out, guys. I've just read the first chapter.
Yeah.
For the audience, and with our amazing producer, Steven, we've been texting about it and talking about it. And Steven, who has helped all of us, I think, understand what is happening in a much larger sense than when I first read through it, said personally it was Roxanne Gay's review that made me have faith in the book after the rough start. And I think that's such a great point of just because it, and I don't think that any of us are saying that, but because it makes us uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not a conversation worth having. And I know we were all chatting about it, and
well, I was getting concerned because a couple of people in Geekbomb Book Club kind of tapped out. They hit a point, and it's like when I was reading through Reddit and other people's interpretations of it and how they felt about the book, I really saw a split. It was, this is one of the best books I've ever read, and it is so powerful. And the other one was, they just went like, Marlon James went too far. And I actually had a conversation with my mum and dad about this because they've read previous works of Marlon James, the one that won the Booker Prize about 4 or 5 years ago. And they were like, he writes to provoke. Like, he challenges you in the way. But my parents actually offered an exploration in the sense that it's like, ask yourself why he feels the need to write about these things and why you are being challenged by him, the author, with these particular things. I do want to talk about a second sort of like infiltration of being forced outside my comfort zone. Not only is it the subject matter, but it's the way that it was written. This is not usual prose. This is like that staccato kind of dialogue.
It's prose poetry. It's very, I was actually, before we went on the air, there's a book that I read in high school because I had a very hippie teacher, but it's called Autobiography of Red. It's by Anne Carson, and it's prose poetry, and it takes the myth of Heracles and Geryon, who is like a giant red beast monster, and uses that as a storytelling device for a young queer boy in Chile, like near a volcano. And it's one of the best things I've ever read. But this reminds me of that as well, where it isn't necessarily about the plot. Like, we know the general framework of the story, but it is this lyrical, rhythmic, like the language is, even when it's just kind of horrific descriptions, the language itself is beautiful. The rhythm itself, you can feel the how the syntax flows. And I think,
but I had to
find kind of make us uncomfortable.
Like, I was like, this isn't usually how I read books. This isn't the flow that I'm used to. So it was being inundated with how the story was being told was different. And then also the subject matter was, for me, very different.
I agree with Maude, and I love the points that she's bringing up. I have been listening to the score from the movie Black Panther by Ludwig Göransson while reading the book, because it's a beautiful score and it's very like African influenced. And the other cool thing I learned in one of the pieces of research in the author is that Marlon James was also a big fan of the movie, even though, again, they're very, very different types of things. Even when the book was coming out, people were like, oh, this is your Black Panther. Oh, this is you taking African mythology and expanding on it and all of that other stuff. I want to go back to one thing that Maude said that I hadn't considered, but I agree with, which is this feels at times as though it is without hope. And to go back to my connection to similar types of stories, which is comic books in the Marvel Comics world, like I was saying, they take real pantheons of gods and goddesses, real Greek gods, real Norse gods, all of these different pantheons, and they put them into their PG-13 Marvel Comics world. And then you have Tom Hiddleston Loki, Chris Hemsworth Thor, these versions of the characters that are really fun and they fit in that world. They leave out all the rated R stuff from those Greek myths and the Norse myths and all of those things that I remember learning.
Grimm's fairy tales were.
Those are rated. Those are horrific. And
a lot of.
I think that popular culture knows about these characters, but tends to sort of, even something like The Little Mermaid, the Disneyfied Little Mermaid is very different than the actual little, and that one's really.
There's a 70s.
Horrific, grotesque,
a Little Mermaid that has the original ending, which, spoiler alert, she ends up foam on the waves.
Yeah.
See, and it was one of my favorite things growing up.
So I wonder, have we been conditioned with Disney movies? What Little Mermaid
absolutely,
was
absolutely.
1990?
Yes.
We are conditioned to believe that true love prevails, that there is always hope, that whatever bad is out there, that good will stop it, or, you know, that's kind of like the structure of our confines of fictional writing and storytelling. And I think in this book, it's like,
that's not how real life is. And I actually prefer, that's for me in, you know, in certain stories, no matter what the medium, I always prefer the darker ending because it does feel, not necessarily like dark for dark's sake, but it feels more.
Depends.
It depends on the story. When I'm reading realistic.
It's an escape. I don't want to escape into bleakness.
I think even if
I'm growing a lot with this book, and I will say the first chapter I would have opted out, and I had a couple of people just, they got refunds, they you know, decided that it just wasn't for them. Don't feel bad about that. If this book is too much for you, that is totally valid. The more I'm reading about the book from other reviewers and people that have read it, they're saying that even if they are completely an intellectual being, this book is difficult for them. They are saying this book is smarter than the smartest person that they know. So like, this is really complex,
it's very
complicated, and I have a feeling I'm going to fumble my whole way through this month. Yay!
But there's some really great comments in the chat that I want to highlight. Different Lachlan Mouse. Lachlan? What?
Lachlan. You guys don't have the name Lachlan? That's huge in Australia. Lucky.
Quartermouth reminds me of Childermass, which if anyone read those books, Stephen, do you remember what they're called? I feel like you must have read them. They had Edward Gorey illustrations. But in Western writing, we're taught to take the narrator by their word. The structure of the book made me question everything Tracker did or told us, and I think that's intentional. 100% unreliable narrator within an unreliable narrator. There's so many elements there.
And he even contradicts himself in that first chapter.
Oh, absolutely. As well. It has all these different endings. And then also Miss Necromancer, as usual, giving us some nuggets of wisdom. There's also the perspective from white fantasy that there's always hope because you are from a place where a white princess lives a pretty cushy life, but to a lot of black people, that is alien. And I think that there is this idea of, you know, framing the assumption in a lot of, especially American culture, but a lot of Western culture, is the default is the white experience. You know what I mean? And I think that opening this up and also throwing you into the deep end of these myths and legends and the sort of oral history and the way that it evolves, I think it's good that we're confused and uncomfortable.
Did before we kind of move on and talk about the author, and I want to, did any of you two feel like any similarity to when we read American Gods?
Yes.
Because I felt sometimes, but not all the time. I felt similarities in the sense of
all the Anansi sequences, and especially, you know, I trailed off the show after Brian Fuller left in season 2, but I thought the first season was the adaptation from the books was so incredible, and especially Orlando Jones, who we had on the show back in the days, who's just a delight, and who was not treated well on that show after Brian Fuller left. But his Mr. Nancy and the sort of very bleak, rightfully angry, rightfully blunt, and explaining why there are these kinds of feelings and where he gets his power from.
Anger is good.
And it's warranted. I mean, come on. And so that reminded me of this, and I thought,
I'll tell you how it didn't. American Gods was very self-centric. So all the gods were holding on to worship. And so it was kind of all about them.
Yes.
And trying to sustain their support in a way. Here, rules are gone. It's not about one person's story, because that, as we've just discussed, the narrator isn't even telling us all truths. Like, it's not a dependable story that we're getting. We're trying to piece together bits of information, and it's done in a way that's both mythological and logical.
Yes.
So like, and that was really confronting as well. It's like, you're speaking like absolute truths. You're not sugarcoating anything. Like, you're breaking the simplest form, but in a way that
there are other options.
It could be metaphor.
Yeah.
It could be metaphor. Like, I don't know if this is even possible, but I wonder if this book, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, if there's a version of this where somebody reads it and goes, yes, I believe that this could have happened, let's say in Africa, with this type of a man going through these types of events. And everything that's happening in the book is almost a metaphor for what this character has to go through.
I don't think that's
for trauma. Absolutely. It could be.
And sexuality and gender and.
But even then, every time we get to a section, every time we get to a section where like he encounters a witch or he encounters a mystical or mythical being, an anti-witch, whatever he encounters, and then some sort of like supernatural power or something happens, I almost feel like, is this really happening, or is this a character sort of? Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
when they started introducing
either way, and they're not mutually exclusive. You know,
and that's what's really confronting, because he was a city dweller that moved into sort of like the nomadic land and you know, became one with sort of like the African wilds, whilst also bringing in supernatural elements. And so it was like, it's an onslaught and there's no clean slate. And Hector, I kind of want to talk to you about this, because I felt that the first few chapters I was lost. I didn't understand that the first three things were stories. I thought that he was reflecting, but they tied together, but they were three completely separate kind of things. And then it moves along. So I was just like, what's going on? But when magic started getting introduced, my favorite part of this book, and obviously we'll explore it more, but it's when we go to the Mingi and the Sagoma, where we learn about the anti-witch, but she's cast a spell and to protect these children. Is it cursed? Are you a witch? No. And you actually start hearing about the magic components of world building, but you can never expect it to be like introduced or world building or have the logical sense of the supernatural elements delivered clearly. There's no structure behind it. You just have to. It's almost
also as though in this world, they are not supernatural elements. They are natural elements. Does that make sense? It's like in this world, a character like Tracker who has some sort of supernatural ability compared to what we know humans can do, because they're telling Tracker, like, you got a nose, you can track anything, you know, like Wolverine, like some X-Men stuff. And then meets a character that's Ghost Girl and she could turn into mist. And it's like, that's X-Men stuff, but it's not something that Tracker's going, I've never seen anything like this before. It's just like a part of the world. It's accepted.
I know we talked about this, I watched it on Nerdist News Talks Back, but y'all were talking about the Animorphs, and there was a series by K.A. Appleby called Everworld about basically a world where all of the gods of every culture were like, we're out, we don't want humans, this kind of sucks, and moved there. But it was very much like of the theory that at a certain time in our history, people did live amongst gods.
Yeah.
And we're used to that sort of thing. I definitely want to get into the specifics. So let's break down just a little bit about the author so we can get into a lot happens. That's my Outlook making noise. My email. But there's a lot that happens and a lot that you feel. It's not necessarily, there is plot, but so Marlon James.
To be honest, we're going to go through chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. I wouldn't mind slowing down on those so I can piece it together. And I was looking at reading Jojo Kiwi, who said the same thing. The first couple of chapters, no idea. But then once they kind of like almost had it as a present tense moving forward, then
so it's
better.
Yeah. So just brief breakdown of the author, and we can talk about him more over the next couple of weeks. But Marlon James, Jamaican writer and professor, he described getting the handle on this story when he was on sabbatical from teaching, and he filled 10 moleskin notebooks with research notes and characters before coming up with the plot. Black Leopard, Red Wolf debuted in February 2019 and is the first installment in the planned Dark Star trilogy.
Quick aside, real quick, based off of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, anybody else, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that the plan for the second and third books are to be this same story told from another character's perspective.
Yes.
As to even
fascinating.
Is to even further the idea of unreliable narrator, as to even further. So like
it's going to be a whole new lens.
Yeah. So I've been
really kind of like highlights the fact that everyone has a unique perspective, and that you actually need to listen and understand to these
gender, sexuality hangups, and how he views women. I'm interested to see who. That's super interesting. And then Michael B. Jordan bought the film rights to the book the same month it came out, February 2019. And as we have discovered, it draws on African folklore and mysticism to build up its fantasy setting. So we'll break down, and I had the same thing where for all of you who have been following along, I've been an audiobook convert for the past 2 years. Thank you, Maude, Garrett. But for this one, I listened to the audiobook and then immediately after the first chapter got the ebook so that I could reference it, because I think the audiobook is so beautifully done and feels like a poem and feels like you are listening to a story. But I needed
for those not listening to it, he puts on an African accent in it to kind of like really hone that authenticism that you are experiencing.
And for the audiobook, quick question for the audiobook listeners, does it feel like first of all, are there multiple voices? Because I know we kind of don't get into that until later. I guess the first few chapters are just Tracker relaying the story, right?
He'll put on a different voice.
Gotcha.
Mildly and not other voice. Artistically, they were interesting choices.
Interesting. And then the second question I had was, in the audiobook, does it sound as though it's a character Tracker telling everything to the Inquisitor or another character? So it's like, let me tell you, this is how it happened. Fine, we're going to get into
train of thought.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, when they're exchanging in dialogue, you can hear the conversation, but majority of the time, the Tracker is speaking in a train of thought.
The structure was what confused me, especially about the first 3 sections. So we read basically chapters 1 through 6 for those who are just joining us. So chapter 1, the story is starting. It starts, and this was confusing to me too. It's told in an interview fashion. If anyone's read World War Z, is a classic example of that, which they didn't really do in the movie, but you know.
Hey, we got Brad Pitt. It's fine. It's fine.
Adaptation. But it's an interview, and so a man who we know as the Tracker, that's all we know as to his name, is telling his story to some sort of inquisitor or priest. This point in the book, it's unclear. A lot of things are unclear at this point. We were confused. At least I was. We're thrown into the deep end of the story right from the beginning and left to pick up the pieces as we go on. I know we've had some experiences like this in our book club, but is this, I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, but do you like being thrown out of your comfort zone? I kind of do, but this one was really tough for me.
It depends.
Chapter 1 is my least favorite chapter of this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I probably agree with Maude too. For me, my experience, to sort of go back to the overall thoughts, but since we're in it now, pretty soon after we were texting each other, and Maude, you were like, heads up, this is very different and it's very gnarly. And I started the first chapter. I kind of quickly realized, okay, this is unlike anything I've ever read. And I want to, it's so well written and very interesting, and the language can be beautiful. I almost feel like I'm going to get through the 600 pages of this book. 620. And then I'll have an understanding.
Including us that for our first section.
Yeah. I feel like I'm going to get through this once, the whole way through, and then barely have a sort of understanding of, you know what I mean? That's what it felt like to me, is I'm like, I'm going to need the full picture before I can. And so, like many books, I just sort of let it roll over me. It was less about me trying to keep up with it or trying to stay on top of it, but more so like, just read it. I'm in the language. I kind of know what's happening. Oh, we shifted to this thing. Instead of going back, I'm like, let me just power through. Keep going. I'm listening to Black Panther. Keep going. Then something hits and I go, whoa. Yeah. Keep going. That's been my experience. It's not a negative one. It's not always the most positive, but it's not something that is completely confusing me where I'm like holding the book upside down. I'm like, I don't know what the hell. I just accepted it and I'm like letting it roll over.
So I feel like we're being thrown into the deep end. I literally felt like chapter 1, I was treading water.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all that was there. And like same things, there are like key things that stuck out to me where I'm like, whoa. And they were the shocking things that they were talking about. The domestic violence, the relationship that he has with his father and mother, not really dad. We'll get into that. But also the detachment that he has as well. And like the nuanced ways where he just conducts life whilst also constantly wanting to learn, but also feeling like he knows everything. That was interesting as well, because usually if someone doesn't know anything, that's a form of exposition. So whilst they're learning about this setup, us, the audience, gets to learn with them. But again, he would pick and choose. I'll tell you about that. That's not really important. I'll wash over that, even though it doesn't make any sense. That's all I'll tell you about. And that for me was just like, oh gosh.
And that's such I think the first, probably same as you two, the first couple of chapters, I wasn't really sure what was happening and thought, you know what, I'm going to listen to it and then I'm going to read it again, and then Stephen will help us understand it, which he did. Thanks, Stephen. But actually, as I got into the later chapters from this section, the framework and what was happening and sort of I think all of the elements that we're picking up on actually do make sense within the story. So we start again, the tracker is being asked to tell the story of a certain boy he was hired to track down twice. All we know is that the boy is dead, but the tracker did not kill him. This chapter, again, which I did not pick up on at all the first time, but later it made more sense. This chapter is basically setting up the larger framing narrative, but it also tells these sort of mini stories to tell what the tracker is like. And you know what it reminded me of was when we, for Geekbomb Book Club, read the first Witcher book.
Interesting. Yeah, I see that.
Not in style or tone at all, but it's someone who is seeking things out. He's emotionally shut down. You're given these stories that tell you who the character is, sort of, because he's also a super unreliable narrator. But I do think that how matter-of-fact he is and how he's playing around with truth and we don't know what he's actually telling us. I think that all does have to do with trauma and how, as we get deeper into the book and dealing with gender norms and sexuality and family expectation, to me, it makes sense that his response to this, to not being included in the, coming of age manhood ceremony and the loss of these male parental figures, not everyone responds the same way. Not every, there's no generalizations, but I do think that shutting down or disassociation or making light of something or, all of those things make a psychological sense to me as we get to know his character.
Yeah. Just to talk about that for a second too, also knowing Marlon James, again, just doing a little bit of research with some interviews, like knowing that he is a gay writer. He had a difficult, very difficult time as a young man figuring that out, and had a very strict religious upbringing, and at one point literally had an exorcism to get the gayness out. Like this sort of trauma that this guy had to deal with, and that knowing that, and it's very interesting and very, again, sort of different than my life experience and things that I've been, made aware of and stuff. And yet some of that real strict religious stuff, I feel like I had a little bit of taste of it being a Mexican guy. My parents from Mexico, where I'm like, they had a very strict Catholic, that's kind of the norm in that culture and country. You know what I mean? So some of that I could feel some
can be a hell
of a thing. But knowing that that Marlon James is gay, I think also, I want to say, helped me understand whenever Tracker sort of got to those moments in the story, because Tracker's relationship with his father is like so traumatic, really effed up. Tracker dealing with his sexuality as he relates to other characters and how the book treats it. Sometimes it's a matter of fact. Sometimes it's like, Tracker, like the narrator or Tracker will say, well, this was a place where like men married men and, and kings were able to marry their slaves and whatever else is part of the world building. And in other parts in the story, it feels like it is the worst possible thing. And there was that whole section about cutting out the woman that's inside of you. I thought was so interesting that every person is born with a certain amount of man and woman. Very interesting stuff.
Relates to Dune. That was exactly what I thought too. So So we kind of go through, I thought was
Yeah.
interesting. The first chapter has these 3 stories that kind of tell us a little bit about Tracker, I think in retrospect, not when you're reading it, but the end of the section also ends in 3 different stories. Like there's a frame within a frame within a frame of this story.
I
So
want to add on to what Hector said really quickly as well, because I remember after the first chapter, I had a conversation with my parents, big book readers, had read a lot of Marlon James before. And I said, look, I find it like there was a part for me, like it's interesting to hear people's breaking points. And for one of Geekbomb's regular sort of book club members, for them, it was the way that the uncle kind of like fondled Amina's genitals. It was just so unnecessary, didn't add to the story. It was kind of like they're having a conversation, but it went one step further, and he was kind of like, time, I don't need that. For me, it was the relationship that he had with the crone, lack of relationship, as a way to pass through, I think, to the underworld or whatever it was. But I think I kind of like butchered it, but I sort of like paraphrased to you guys what that was and just like the graphic nature of it. But I think for me, the fact that it was like lack of connection and it was something that needed to be done, and that, you know, lack of empathy, or for me, that was kind of like, that was a bit abrupt and a bit confronting for me, where it was like, oh, which is why rape is confronting as well, because it's a consent thing. But for the way that was kind of handled, and the specificities of it being, you know, the things that you gloss over were just
it's
up front and in your face. And then mum and dad, I think it was dad goes, you know, the author's gay. And it was this thing where I was like, oh, okay.
Changes the whole context of, it is something to get, not that it's good or bad, but it, all of his interactions with women, I think, in this book are also, there's
wasn't a lack of connection. There was no attraction, but it was an exchange. And like kind of just hearing that, the reasoning behind that, it I guess it took some of the power out of that.
I can see that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. Yeah.
The Lua and that sort of the Lula, the river tribe that like is gender fluid essentially, and the relationships as we get deeper into the book, but also that male and the sort of, you weren't circumcised young enough, so you have, you know, this female part of you that's bad, but also the children who are cursed, and the anti-witch is like, they were never cursed. So this idea of of othering people as a way to control them, or, you know, gain power. And I think that's it's not in a form that we're super used to in this kind of a narrative, but it is very much like, are they cursed, or are they just from a tribe that you have a blood feud with, and so you're just murdering children and creating some, you know, propaganda about this other tribe essentially.
An extension onto the story that I was talking about, I think I was so, because this was like one of the first times where any kind of like sexual interaction happened, and it was so devoid of connection, and it was really like I said, really empty exchange. I actually missed the myth behind that until I went back and looked through the chapter breakdown. And this crone, it wasn't an old woman getting abused particularly, like per se, but she was a woman who lived an entire lifetime throughout the day. And she died at night to be reborn, and she lived her entire life again. So by the time he sees her in the afternoon, she's an old woman. And I was just kind of like, I missed all of that because you were trying to shock me with the what, and I didn't learn about the how.
And it's also matter of fact, sort of accepted in that world. This is a piece that is so interesting. And I think like engaging when reading the book is that I know for a fact, I know more about the Norse gods than any African gods in our world. I know more about the Greek gods than any African gods. So part of me,
taught to us in America. I mean,
so part of me reading this is going, interesting. I wonder if this element is something that Marlon James sort of created or embellished himself, or if this is something that is straight up taken from like African folklore and put into this world.
Because I looked up some of the like the manhood ceremony, and I think that's interesting.
Maude, I didn't know about the crone aging all in one day. I didn't know that.
Because I was so hung up on like the on one
That's
particular point of
what interests me about any kind of religion or myth or legend, and we've definitely talked about this during American Gods and other topics we've gone through, but it's essentially human beings trying to answer the same questions, right? And so that to me reminds me of how does the sun rise and fall? Well, there's a god in a chariot that, you know, drapes the night sky over.
Totally.
And I just think it's really great that we're exposed to this now and can kind of learn. I mean, it would be great if our school curriculums would open up our minds a lot more, but
yeah. And like I said at the beginning, like, I'm going to let this thing wash over me. I'm going to try not to do so much sort of research in the moment. And hopefully, if and when we get a live action version of this, whether it's a movie or TV show, and Michael B. Jordan, if you're watching, I got to lean towards TV show, bro. This thing is dense. Give it some space. Give it some time. Even seeing something like this told in some kind of fashion in live action would even further my understanding of the myths, of the storytelling, of the folklore, of the spoken tradition. Maude, you mentioned that. You read that from your review at the beginning of this episode about how somebody was saying that it mirrors that spoken oral tradition. And I totally agree. That's how the book reads to me.
Yes.
So I'm not trying to like keep up and like learn in the moment. Let's just let the story wash over me. And eventually later, I will probably, hopefully have a better knowledge of some of these like real African pieces of folklore, which is very interesting. I want to read really quick some really great comments talking about overall the book. Eric Sladler says, you kind of have to reread parts of it for it to sink in. Yes. I was baffled for the first couple chapters, but I was swept away by the language. And the Tamaranian said, this was giving me adult Spirited Away vibes. That's very interesting too, because Spirited Away, Japanese folk and myth, you know, and has rules that in that story, the rules seem so harsh to what maybe Americans have been accustomed to with like those kinds of stories where like the little girl's parents just turn into pigs, and you can't, like, these kinds of things that are a little bit Grimm's fairy tales. So I think that's a very interesting read on that as well. That's how I felt when I watched Spirited Away for the first time. I was like, I have no idea what the hell is going on. It's animated beautifully, but what in the hell? What are the rules of this world? And it was all nonsensical to me, but it's all based on
bread and water.
I think you can also tell that Marlon James is a professor, because this reminds me of how I would read certain books in college, depending on the professor. But, you know, my favorite was using theory and historical context, which obviously we do on book club anyway on a deep level. But the idea of reading into, you know, systems of power or gender dynamics or things like that. And so each section that I'm reading, I find myself wanting to go back and research and do some digging so that as I go to the next section. So as always, we're always reading things a little bit differently, but my brain has been immediately going like, what did that mean after we're done?
Same, which is why I completely understand why you went off Audible so that you can read it. And the best and worst thing about this book is that he'll drop something so profound that I'll spend the next 5 minutes so locked on that thought while the story continues.
You've missed it. Yeah.
That's like, what? And one of the things that I really blew my mind in the first chapter was the notion that not everything the eye sees should be spoken by the mouth. Which is repeated throughout the book and it feels like a commentary on, we don't know that Tracker is telling us the truth. We don't know. There's so many ways you can look at that. Or not. Yeah. So my initial thought for that is look, don't speak. And I remember someone saying something to me where it's like, count your words, or like, make sure that every time you speak, it has purpose and it has, like, you know, weight behind it. Don't just speak because you can. Yeah. You know, like, speak with quality over quantity. Mm-hmm. And so, like, that's where my 5 minutes went off to. I was just like, oh my gosh, we have someone who's looking and who's obtaining information. And then you have the second component, which is he's looking and listening, but the things that he's saying aren't necessarily matched. Mm-hmm. And he's finding that words are a weapon that he can use to his advantage or use to protect himself. And I just spent so much thought on the notion that everything that you see shouldn't be spoken by mouth.
And then the story keeps going and keeps going. And you're like, what happened?
What the hell just happened? And then I'm like, all right, let it wash over me. Or, oh, well.
It does speak to, this larger frame. So we basically have in chapter 1, he's speaking to this Inquisitor. We don't know that the things he's saying or accusing the Inquisitor of, we don't know what's true. Is he, before we started, we were saying, like, he's kind of a troll. He's sort of like poking holes in things and creating different scenarios.
He's
and
provocative.
Then once we get to chapter 2, and most of you go back and forth between the framework, but the present tense is young tracker sort of becoming the tracker that is in this work.
Right.
And so in chapter 2, after we go through these 3 stories, one of which is him leaving his father's house, either his father is dead or injured, but the result is the same. He still has to leave, which I found really interesting, that sometimes potentially, this was my read of, family is a big part, but how you interact with someone, it might be a lose-lose for you. It doesn't, like, if someone doesn't, if you are exposed to a person who has certain expectations or follows a certain pattern, you may as well make the choice that makes you feel better, because no matter what you do, there's still going to be this negative presence in your life.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting.
Yeah.
But as he leaves his father's house.
Well, I kind of want to touch on something that was a little bit before, still in chapter 1, where when the tracker was going through the sort of jobs that he was doing to get a sense of who he was, more often than not, it was that he was finding people who had escaped bad situations and then forcing them to return. Mm-hmm. So in this first chapter, he has an abusive father. His mother gets beaten as well. He's treated with no respect. He's in a really bad situation and he's trying to leave it. But then we notice that every other person who's in that same boat who have left, he's almost punishing them by bringing them back into those bad situations that they've tried to flee from. That is such a contradiction of who he is. And that's when my distrust started forming. I was like, dude, whose side are you on here?
Mm-hmm.
He's projecting, though. He's going after people that are trying to escape something while he's actually trying to escape things. He's clearly running away from his family and whatever happened with the boy, and he's supposed to find people, and yet he's always sort of lost himself. That's what I mean.
The original.
It's almost like
10 minutes left and the next few chapters to go through.
So much.
Oh my gosh! Sorry.
Fine. No, totally fine. I just want to, I mean, we've all read. We don't.
This is going to be a good after show over at the Geekbomb Discord. Good after show.
We can go a little long, says our producers. What are you? Sorry, this little child. Can you not?
No,
all right, chapter 2. Tracker resumes his story of Flint's father's house. He watches animals to learn how to survive in the bush. Then we are introduced to another aspect of Tracker. He has a wolf eye that makes the Inquisitor uncomfortable. What's really interesting is that a lot of people are paying attention to his eye, but the thing that's really special about him is his nose. What happened to his eye? We don't really know about that one just yet. He spends time. Thank you. He spends time with the witch man before a witch man brings him to a village and introduces him to his uncle. I don't know what their relationship is. A rich man in town with a big house, many wives and children. He's like, hey, you can help yourself to absolutely everything here except for my multiple polygamous wives. All right, cool. These people are the Ku, and their enemies are the Gangatom, who live across the river. Mm-hmm. The uncle tells Tracker that it is too late for him to undergo the
rights to,
thank you, become a man, aka the
Zareba.
Is it the Zareba?
Zareba?
I don't know.
Zareba?
Audiobook.
Zareba. Oh, I like Zareba. Because he was not circumcised and thus forced to have both male and female desires. So again, we are looking at black and white when it comes to gender.
On this one theory, because it
this is fascinating because he's using sort of like a Jewish tradition, but in a way that circumvents whether you are, sorry to use circumvent, but kind of like discusses or defines whether you are a man or a woman. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting in later chapters when he kind of like, again, uses the mythology that the gods, distributed sexual pleasure, and men got jealous that women were able to have a greater sexual pleasure than they were able to have, hence the female mutilation. I'm going to call it mutilation because that's what it is.
It
Sorry.
is. Absolutely. It is mutilation.
Yeah. And that's
but
very
it's interesting that it's like, if you still have your foreskin, then you are both female and male, and you cannot ever become a man.
Yep.
Which honestly, in thinking about masculinity as it exists today in a very toxic form, like I think more people would benefit from having the male and female experience and not being judged by whatever their physical attributes are.
This might be TMI, but if this is the law, then all of Australian men are bisexual. So.
And again, I say, introduce me to your Australian friend. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, wow.
But
Whoa!
I do need it. Yeah. Okay. So, where did we? Yeah. What's happening with the uncle?
Can I tell you something? I read that. I interpreted that section to be a little bit of found family. Is that Tracker appears to this group, and this guy goes, "Yeah, you're my nephew," and Tracker's like, "Are you sure about that?" "Yeah, you are." And then it's just like a thing. Assumed. But there may be a familial connection there.
But you mentioned uncles previously, saying you've just killed your dad, but your uncles are so much meaner.
Grandfather. But I actually think the found family is when we get into the later chapters of the section, and when he meets Leopard and Kava, and
I think I was trying to relate that section to my own life experience or understanding of the sort of my world around me, and I feel like if this again is a metaphor for a young man who breaks off from his family, mother, father, that situation. And like you were saying, Rachel, whether the father is dead or alive, it doesn't matter. The result is the same, which is true. When people cut toxic people out of their family, and it's really sad and really tragic. This is so sad. And one of the saddest things about being alive is when something like this has to happen or happens, that family member is as good as dead to that person who made that choice. So here we have Tracker, and he's made the choice, and he's gone. And I felt like it was a
ghost. I think there's not to interrupt you, just
no,
is a very personal thing for me as well. And I think there's the concept that if you do cut someone important out of your life, that they are just gone. But I think that haunts you because your feelings don't go away. It doesn't mean you don't love them. And I think Tracker is doing the thing that a lot of people do, that is sort of like, well, they're gone.
That's it.
That doesn't mean they're actually gone to them.
Right.
And so it's haunting him in this quest for vengeance and all of these things.
In
the
this
vengeance
section,
was almost forced upon him as well, because when the Tracker has visions of his grandfather asking for vengeance against the Gangatam, the uncle reveals that the visions are actually of his true father, who died in a war of retribution against the Gangatam. So again, he's finding out that his grandfather's actually his dad. His dad kind of died because he started this war and killed someone, and now it's up to him to take on, you know, this legacy of vengeance and to basically enter this revenge fest so that he can reclaim his title, even though he's not necessarily a man and he can't ever get the
he's definitely
of doing the deed because he hasn't been circumcised.
He's manipulated by this uncle
situation.
And what I love is that as he sort of is getting to know this the Ka and all of these people, and meets Kava, that was when this book started to really open up to me, to see that Tracker had these desires and feelings. That's sort of the beginning of that. But then as Kava takes Tracker out of the tribe and out into the bush together, and they start encountering we meet Leopard of the co-titular Leopard anyway, but the fact that we see him just take to these children and take to this another new experience, and he seems very open to it as young Tracker, whereas big picture Tracker is just pissed and wants to fuck with you and doesn't care and hates everything. And it's like, because we see what happens in these chapters, and he gets so hurt and is manipulated and doesn't know who to trust. So of course he's going to end up being this sort of closed off.
It's just dawned on me that because of this, to use Hector's kind of terminology in a way, the tracker and the language spoken is almost like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy, where
very literal.
It is absolutely literal. It is a logical approach. It is often void of emotion. And I'm discovering more and more that Tracker cannot be shocked or really like all that surprised. Nothing is necessarily shocking to him. He just takes it on and wears it and applies it. And I think the reason why the terminology and the way that it's presented to us is so shocking is that it's because he's not processing the shock value of it and providing it in a
matter of fact.
It seems like he grew up in I mean, obviously some sort of trauma, but I think
he compartmentalizes.
Yeah, he's
like the fact that he found out that his mom was his mom, but his dad wasn't his dad, he was his grandfather. We are dealing with incest, people, and he kind of goes, "Oh, that sucks. That's not good."
Because I don't think he's equipped necessarily with the tools, and a coping mechanism is, I think that the language and the character sort of are a chicken and an egg situation of, he doesn't know how to deal with these things. He's obviously grown up, as many people in many cultures are, with different ideas of what it means to be a man and what it means to have feelings or not. And because we're thrown in at the beginning without knowing any of his history, it feels sort of callous and matter of fact and all of those things. But once you see his longing and his who he connects with and how he views the world when he's younger versus sort of the older being interviewed Tracker, it makes sense in retrospect that he would behave and view things this way, because
I think
he's been trained
to
do that through his experiences.
I think it's so purposeful that the first few chapters are Tracker telling this Inquisitor, okay, I'll tell you about my life, but I'm going to start at the beginning and me as a kid. Because if we didn't have that to inform how Tracker acts later, just like Maude said, that it would be like, whoa, who is this character? It's so disassociated and so detached from everything. But to live, or at least hear in Tracker's words, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And we know that to be traumatic. We're like, whoa, dude, slow down.
What happened to me?
Because
I'm struggling with this because I'm so empathetic. Like I put the pathetic in empathetic a lot of the time. Like I feel for me triple. Yeah. I feel for other people. It wears on me and sticks. So for him to be very dismissive, I was kind of like that was another confronting piece for me. And especially usually the narrator tells the entire story, which involves the emotional breakdown of what you're experiencing.
But he's
so you take that away, but you double down on like the shockingness that's happening.
I wonder if within this story, we're only 6 chapters in. I wonder if within this story that Tracker will reconcile with that. I wonder if Tracker will, as the character is in this moment, narrating everything to us, after the fact, if that's going to be something that this book is going to explore. I'm fascinated by it.
I would be interested too, because I think he does actually show later on in these chapters, as we get into what happens with the Sangoma and the betrayal of Kava and him being intimate with Kava and then Leopard and all of the different jealous, but he has the capacity for so much feeling and empathy, really, but not towards himself and not visibly.
I don't know. I think when he's confronted with things, he approaches it with denial. He approaches it with a nihilistic.
Do you mean young Tracker or current Tracker?
Chapters 1 to 6 Tracker. Like when he first is introduced,
Tracker is not. I think baby Tracker is a little more open to it.
Yep. I mean, personally, I think that he allows it and then might take time to process it, but sometimes not. When he meets the Sagoma, he cannot see that she's an anti-witch. He immediately labels her. That's exactly who he feels that she is. So
yeah, that's true.
He explains time and time again, no, you keep labeling me with this, but you don't even know what a witch is. You have very little understanding about it. So obviously that goes further, where it's like, this is one of the first female interactions that we've had and seen, and immediately it's negative.
Taking sort of
but it's not coming from a place of learning.
Ideas as true.
That's his coping. He goes, you are now this, that is who you are, that is how I cope. I'm labeling you that.
And she goes,
traumatic reaction too, is just how do I distance myself? I just think, at least my interpretation is not by his actions, but the fact that he is putting up these boundaries, but still connecting with certain people means that, or at least my view of it is that he wants somewhere to connect, but like doesn't actually know, which is why
I don't even see the wanting part. I see that there is actually no capacity, and having dealt with someone who is absolutely has zero capacity to deal with things in an emotionally mature level. It just, for some people, it doesn't exist as much as you want it to.
I want to ask about.
I like to believe that people have that capacity when they don't.
And that's why
a lot about
going back to fuckboys, Rachel.
It's same for sure.
Yeah, I wish I could say same, but it's not that. That's not the case for me. I want to ask about, in that same vein with that conversation, because I'm like, I don't know if I have enough information yet, even though we're 6 chapters in, 120 plus pages. You know, we've learned about Tracker's young life. We've learned about some adolescent stuff, and we kind of know where Tracker is at this point. And I still am like, I don't know if I have enough information to determine if I feel like I can relate to Tracker, root for Tracker, if Tracker's a good dude or a bad dude. And maybe it's because
I don't feel any of fact. Yeah, I don't have any of that. I do get the vibe that I just feel like he is, and again, you're totally right, Mom. This is definitely like my thing, but I do feel like someone dealing with so many different traumas and having so many walls up, but then connecting with the kids and the way, like, I feel like the potential is there, but also that's
but then having to old Yeller
and real, so.
having to old Yeller that kid away to have the kid stay in the village, right? Ghost girl. And he was like, get out of here. I don't love
like
you.
Throwing the stick at
go.
Old Yeller just dies. So that's
that's true. What am I thinking of? White Wolf? What's White Fang? What's the movie I'm thinking of where like
they're all very
where they say get out of here.
But
here's what I wanted to ask, because I'm very interested in this conversation, is so like, where do we feel that Tracker is? Is he emotionally anything? Because
I think he's a compartmentalizer. I think he is someone dealing with trauma. I mean, the cartographer made an amazing point earlier on in the comments on YouTube, and that was the detachment of his name. He abandoned his name when he left his father. And so for him, that was a coping mechanism where he was to provide or to establish a brand new identity because that was dead. And that represented that history.
Very interesting. It's very interesting. The character of Wolverine did the same thing in his story. Disregarded his father's name, and then his own brain healed his own memories for a traumatic reason, and took the name Logan and went by that instead.
Do you reckon Logan's bisexual? Because there was something going down with Saber
everyone's
father when it was the actual law, where there was like some sexual
but then later the comics maybe revealed that like they were brothers. It's interesting. I don't know. For as long as Wolverine lived, he's probably hooked up with a dude. Let's be real. Come on. He's lived a long life. But what I wanted to ask about, speaking of Sabretooth and Wolverine, here's what I wanted to ask about. And also our producer, Steven, let me know, Harry and the Hendersons was the movie where they had to tell the character, get out of here. Well, we don't love you.
Harry and the Hendersons.
Okay.
God, what a deep cut. Thank you.
Stay on track. Here we go. I want to ask about Leopard, because the title of the book.
I know.
Unless I'm wrong, I feel like Red Wolf is Tracker and Black Leopard is Leopard. And this cover, look at this cover. They're intertwined. And I feel like
they love each other.
Everything that you are saying, Rachel and Maude, about the character's capacity, I feel like, I can see that. And yet I still feel while reading it that there is something between him and Leopard.
Absolutely.
There's something there.
That is showing him all facets of exploration.
And he's such a confident
Let me teach you up. Let me teach you sexuality. Let me teach you how to be the man and the woman.
I found it interesting because they have sort of this triangle going on, that Kava is very much more of a like we talked about in Dune, more of a feminine, like quiet planning behind the scenes. Leopard is very confident and like sort of alpha. Yeah. But I think, just to get back to your point, because we are running out of time, but we are going to continue the conversation. But I think that Tracker, as he is now, does not have the capacity. I think he has gone down a path that has put him with a million walls up. But the younger version of him that we read in this section, I think has the potential to get there.
But something happened.
Doesn't. And I think that happens on a more real sense for a lot of people, that, you know, anyone has the capacity to change and do work and all of those things. But if you spend, you know, the bulk of your life being like, I'm right and I don't have to make any changes, then it's going to be really hard for you to do that, you know, in your 40s when you get a sports car or whatever. So.
Cool. That makes sense.
Well, we have so much more to talk about. And we will
we barely got through 3 of 6 chapters.
Like, I know. And so we're going to regroup and make sure that we can discuss everything next week, and we'll keep talking after this. But for now, it is your call to action homework. What are you going to read? You're going to read up to the end of chapter 14. So stop before you hit 15. So 7 to 14. You can also check out previous episodes of this show, Nerdist Book Club, on Nerdist and Geek and Sundry's YouTube, or on Geek and Sundry's Twitch. If you could, we would love if you would like and subscribe. That would be super dope. Send us your additional thoughts, book recommendations, anything book related. Just
We're on Goodreads.
On Goodreads, on Twitter, Instagram, wherever you find the internet. Oops. And Maude, where are we going next?
Yes, look, we only got through 3 out of 6 chapters. Obviously, this is a very complex and concentrated conversation that we are having. If you do want to continue the conversation, we'll be heading on to Geekbomb's Discord, which is a voice call chat that we do a Q&A on. It is a perk on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/Geekbomb. Some of the things that we will absolutely be discussing are these mutant kids. The fact that albino people in Africa are harvested, like the curses that are associated with children. We'll talk about the supernatural elements, the world building, the Sagoma fate. We're also going to be talking about this love triangle. We're going to go into more about the monster who eats dead flesh. What, again, such a gruesome but visceral scene. I'm going to talk about the fact that the sensory kind of like descriptions in the way that he writes books, where everything is like inundated with particular smells, and a lot of the times the smells are very bad, but how it's a sensory experience reading this book. All those conversations happening in Geek Bomb within the next 5 minutes, so join us over there. It'd be great.
We love y'all. Thanks for joining us. Again, join us later for the after show. Send us your recommendations, send us your thoughts on Twitter, Goodreads, all the internet places. And the sleepy cat says bye.